Thanks. So I'll start and I'll make an introduction. It's been very, very amazing to me that we have Michael joining us. It's 20 years just about since maybe a wee bit less, that I was introduced to the making of a mediator. Subtitle, Developing Artistry. I can't remember the full subtitle. And these were novel and surprising ideas to me. And ever since, as I mentioned in my interview, the use of written reflection has been particularly an important part of my practice. I sometimes chuckle at some of the questions. Quite a detailed inventory, actually, and there's one of the questions where I always find myself responding. I think there's one of the questions says something about how did you deal with these problems, and I often say I didn't think they were problems. So I'm kind of answering back, but it has been phenomenally useful, and I suppose that's part of the preamble to why it's great for us in Scotland to be able to reach out across the Atlantic. Much of, I guess, the mediation academic underpinning is North American. I think, I have to acknowledge that, and there are some cultural challenges with that, actually, to be fair, but it's a fact of life, and I've looked across the Atlantic for a huge set of resources, and the book that Michael co-authored 20 years ago has been a key part of that, and therefore influences my practice, which is reflected in the master's program, and influences the clinic's practice, which is really what today's theme is about. I think beyond that, Michael, I don't have a great deal to add. I know that your career is now taking you into, I think, quite a supportive role in helping people to make more of maybe some of the written things, but to especially in the notion of reflective practice groups. And I very, very much look forward to hearing more about that. But I think on that, well, before I hand over to you though, I just want to say, because this is on a seminar mode, you don't appear, only the panel appear on the screen. And if you could use the Q&A for any questions to Michael, and then I will read that, and it means Michael's not distracted by having to look at the Q&A all the way through his talk. But that's the only other instruction I would like to make, and with great pleasure, Michael, I'd like to hand over to you at this point.
Thank you very much, Charlie. If I may, just to offer one comment in response to something you said, which is very, well, two comments really. The notion about cultural applicability is something that I'm keenly concerned about and wondering about. And I'm going to be doing a conversation really that is hosted by a fellow named Vikram Singh, who goes by Mediator Vikram. And he's done wonderful edutainment programs, he calls them. And the specific focus is going to be on whether, and if so, how reflective practice works across cultures. Does it really? Are there such important cultural distinctions that we need to make accommodation? I'm very concerned about not just taking something that may be North American in origin and assuming that it has universal applicability. I doubt that it does. I wonder whether it does, and we're going to begin exploring that. As another point I'll make is that some of the research that I've done that has influenced me has come from the UK, particularly people who were working in the nursing profession. Christopher John's work, David Kolb, Gibbs, Jennifer Moon, they're all people whose writings and thinking about reflective practice have been really important as I've been thinking about it. So there is a breadth, but is it limited to the UK and the US? Well, I hope not, but we'll see.
Sorry, Michael. So just to say, I'm going to spotlight you now. Is that okay? So for your talk, and then when you're finished, we'll go back into panel. If you don't mind.
Good. And then I'll share my screen in just a moment. So welcome. I'm pleased to be here and delighted. And I really want to thank Charlie and Ilan and others at the university for the opportunity to have this, what I'm thinking of as a conversation today. Yes, you know, I'm going to show some slides and I'm going to do some talking, but what I'm really hoping is that through questions and comments, it is more of a conversation than just my spewing out ideas and you're sitting and just listening and absorbing. I eagerly I encourage you to ask questions and make comments. You can do that throughout the presentation as well. I'm planning to leave 10 to 15 minutes, I hope, toward the end of the hour for just specifically for that, but you don't need to wait that long. And thank you, Charlie, for agreeing to sort of monitor what's happening with the Q&A so we can address that. I'm going to begin, if I can get my slides up here and get this going. There we are. So I'm calling this presentation The Pillars of Reflective Practice, and there's a particular reason why I've chosen that. I've been engaged in thinking about reflective practice, writing about it, teaching it, and now, as Charlie mentioned a little bit ago, my principal connection to reflective practice is that in addition to teaching and doing some webinars like this, is that I facilitate 8 monthly reflective practice groups for mediators with participants from the UK, from Ireland, Canada, US, Africa, and Trinidad. I've chosen the topic of the pillars because in my experience, we spend a lot of time talking about the models of reflective practice, the techniques that we use, whether it's a reflective journal or a individual supervision, or as Charlie referred to earlier, the inventories. My colleague, Sofnat Peleg-Baker, in a workshop later is going to be talking about a structured reflective instrument. And then there are the reflective practice groups. So we spend a good bit of our time thinking about, talking about, and working in and with these kinds of methods. But I wanted to sort of take a step back today and talk about what I think of as, and I've called the pillars of reflective practice. And I think of them as the foundations that support all of the various methods. So that's how I'm going to approach this. And I'm going to begin with a story. And I think I hope that you will hear in this story the echoes and reverberations of some of these pillars that I'm later going to describe and talk a bit about. So here's the story. I was returning home from a work trip. And the last leg of my journey was an hour-long flight. It was the last flight of the day. I was going to be arriving back in my home, close to midnight. The flight was around 9 o'clock, and I was tired from the trip, eager to get home and see my wife, and looking forward to being at home again. And I boarded the plane, and I settled myself in my aisle seat, and had my Kindle reader in my hand, and was set to just sort of read for a little bit and relax for the hour-long journey. And I noticed next to me in the middle seat was a young girl of probably 8 years old. And she was on her knees. And she had a controller in her hand, and she was playing a game on the seatback console. And this is the game she was playing, although instead of knots and crosses, X's and O's, she was playing with pelicans and fish. She was a pelican, and her opponent was a fish. On the window seat was a man whom I initially assumed and later was confirmed was her father. It was impossible not to feel the excitement and the energy coming from this girl as she played the game. She was quite literally bouncing on the seat on her knees and chattering away at the screen. And I pretended to read for a bit, but frankly, she was so compelling. And there's a little bit of voyeur in many of us, and I was curious what was going on that so pulled her in. And so I would look over occasionally and see the game that she was playing. And she must have played 5 or 6 games. And then she turned to her father and in a complaining voice, she said, Dad, this game's no fun. Nobody wins. It always ends in a tie. And her dad looked up at her and he said, well, why do you think that happens? She said, I don't know. She said, I'm so frustrated about it. And he said, well, what do you think you could do about it? She said, I don't know. And then she thought for a moment and she got a bright smile on her face and she turned to her father and she said, I'm going to put my pelican in the corner and see what happens. He said, okay. And so she did. And she put her pelican in the corner and she won that game. And she won the next game. And she won the next. And then a 4th. And then the 5th was a tie. And then the next few were also ties. And again, in frustration, she turned to her father and she said, Dad, it sort of worked, but now everything is back to the same. What do I do? He said, why do you think that's happening? She said, I think the computer figured out what I'm doing and it's playing against me. He said, okay, so what do you think you should do about that? And she said, I'm going to put my pelican in the middle. He said, okay, let's see what happens. And she did. She put the pelican in the middle and the same thing happened, which is that she won several games and then they returned to the same thing that happened, the tie. They were tie games and, by that time we were in descent mode and she had to put the controller away and get ready for landing. And I thought to myself in the moment and as I was exiting the plane, as I was walking to collect my luggage, I thought 2 things. One, I hope that there were moments when I, as a father, were that good with my children, that supportive, that encouraging. And the other thing I thought is, this is a perfect example of reflective practice, of what I think of as the essence of reflective practice. Namely, that she was learning for herself about the game and how to play the game. Her father could have given her instructions. He could have said, try this, try that. He could have been tired, exasperated, whatever. He could have told her how to play the game and she would have done that. And then when she'd been successful, she would have attributed it to her father's advice. And when it wasn't successful, she would have been back to saying, well, what do I do now? And the father could have said, well, try this instead. He didn't. He very patiently just asked her questions to help her think. And it wasn't just that she was learning how to play this game. She was learning how to learn, how to think. And that was the most extraordinary thing. I wish that I'd had the time and the presence of mind to speak to the father and tell him how much the experience meant to me. But that moment passed, and so what I carry with me is this absolutely marvelous story. So I'm going to now move on and talk a bit about the pillars of reflective practice. And I call them pillars because they are the support. You know, it's like the foundation of a building. The building doesn't stand without those foundations being there, but we don't look at the foundation. What we look at the facade, we look at the arrangement of rooms, we look at the configuration of windows, we look at the color, we look at the materials, but we don't often think about what supports that building and allows it to exist. So here's the first, which is to remain curious. And the reason for me this is the first is not just that it's the most important, it is that it's all encompassing. In every one of the other pillars, there is an echo of the notion about curiosity. And when I think about curiosity, I think about, well, I have...
Michael, so I'm so sorry to interrupt. The slide display isn't really working for us, and I wonder if you need to click on slideshow on PowerPoint. No, that's it. That's it. Sorry.
Thanks for
Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much, Charlie. So when I think about remaining curious, I think about the 5, 6, 7-year-old child who comes to you with a question. And when you answer the question, the response from the child is, why? And then you answer that question and the child says, why? And this process can go on and on and on until either the child is tired and distracted and goes off someplace, or you become tired with the process of answering questions. But children at that age, they are voracious learners. They're omnivorous. They want to see, touch, feel, sense, learn about everything. And that sense of curiosity, if you were to graph it, and I've actually seen a graph, in children from 0 to 8 or 10 years old is almost a vertical line. The extent of their curiosity is boundless. And then it begins to taper off. By the time you get into your 20s and 30s, it actually is declining because we think we already know enough. We've gained a vast amount of knowledge, and therefore our curiosity, we are more relying on what we know than being curious about what we don't know. And my concern is that we remain curious because otherwise we can rely on our old habits, on the way in which we can become complacent. And we tend to see things in patterns in a way that if something is different from the pattern, we may ignore it, we may minimize it, we may dismiss it instead of paying attention. And our sense of curiosity is what brings in the information. It allows that sense of awakening and puzzlement to occur. And it's that forms the foundation for the kind of questions we want to ask ourselves in order to learn more fully. And the next is learning ceaselessly. I want to make a brief distinction without going into great philosophical discussion about this, but there is a real distinction between gaining knowledge and learning. If the father had told the daughter how to play the game, she would have gained knowledge. She would have had facts. She would have had rules. She would have had information. Knowledge is vital. But what I'm talking about is learning, which is the synthesis of knowledge. It is the ability to take the knowledge and modify your practice. So it's learning. And I'll give you a quote from Albert Einstein, who said that education is not the learning of facts, but the training of the mind to think. And this process of learning happens when we are willing to be curious, when we are willing to be surprised, when we are willing to embrace the uncertainty of practice. The next, and you'll see this, these continue to build one on the other, is inviting the unexpected. Donald Schoen says that the process of reflection occurs when the practitioner allows himself to experience surprise, puzzlement, or confusion in a situation which he finds uncertain or unique. One of the things that happens, especially when we do similar types, that we mediate similar types of disputes over and over and over, is that we can find ourselves saying internally, I know what this is all about. This dispute is about X. This is about Y. It's just like the last two I did yesterday. It's about the ones I did. It's this. I can already predict how the parties are going to behave. I have a sense about what the outcome is likely to be. And when we do that, we shut off information that can help us understand more about that dispute, and more particularly about the parties in the dispute. And if we don't invite the unexpected, the surprising pieces of information into the mediation room, we're going to overlook that. And this is a problem because habit, which is what I'm talking about, it can really become a nemesis to us. When we allow ourselves to fall into a habit, we can become a bit jaded. We can become inured to the surprising and uncertain events that happen. We can feel numb even. Our practice doesn't feel as invigorating as we would like it to be. We don't have the experience of being on our toes and being actively engaged. And it's, I think of it as the worst of it is like the safety announcements before a flight. There are certain things that that the flight attendants are required to say. They say it in the same way, and there's a reason for the regimentation. It's so that that on those announcements, every single element is covered. It's a government-imposed requirement. I get that, but think about your experience. Do you learn anything new from that? No. Even if you're on a different type of airplane than one you've been on before, it's unlikely you're going to reach into the seat back pocket and pull out the flyer and read about the exit locations and so on. I've watched when the flight attendants ask people who are in exit rows to, do you have this problem, this problem, this time? Are you willing to do this? Are you willing to do this? Are you willing to do this? And it's almost as though they don't pay any attention to the answers. They just assume that the answer is going to be yes, otherwise why are they sitting in the exit row to begin with? But they have to ask the questions, but they don't pay attention to the answers. And I think that they would be, in some situations, they would probably be surprised and pass over if somebody said, no, I'm not so sure about that. I don't know that they would hear it because it's become such a routine. That can be a real problem in our practice. So we need to invite the unexpected. We need to be open to receiving it and welcome it in. The next piece is that we need to be aware of our beliefs, our values, our principles, because our beliefs act like a lens or a series of lenses through which we are taking in information about the parties and about their dispute, and about the ways in which they're interacting, about the history of the dispute, about its impact on them, about the possibilities for settlement. And as we take that information in, each of us has a different set of lenses. You know, I couldn't wear Charlie's glasses and he couldn't wear mine. We wouldn't be able to see properly if we did. We are different in that way. And I've done this experiment with students before, where I briefly describe a practice situation. And then I ask, how do you explain what's going on? What's this conflict all about? And if I have 10 people in the class, I have 8 explanations. And the 8 explanations are well thought out, they're considered, and they are potentially correct. And the reason we have that many is because people see things in different ways. They pay attention to some information, and ignore other information. They give greater meaning to something than another piece. So being aware of our beliefs. And in the first book I co-authored, my colleague Allison Taylor and I were discussing this notion about beliefs and values and theories, and she said we should call it the constellation of theories, and so we did. And this is, I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but this is an updated version of what we had in the book 20 years ago. At the center are our core beliefs and values. These are pretty immutable. These are the values that we learned as children. They are familial values. They may be influenced by our education, by our teaching, by our religious practices and beliefs. They're very, very, and to some extent, they are ingrained in us. Maybe you call it through DNA. You know, for example, I think of myself as a relatively optimistic person. The glass can always be refilled. It's not half empty or half full. And that attitude translates into my work as a mediator in one respect. I don't give up. I mean, I don't browbeat people into finding a settlement, but I'm willing to keep working and exploring as long as I can do so with dignity and with respect for them. I don't give up easily because I have hope. So that's one set of lenses. The other are the applied theories, what we learn in school. Maybe it's theories about power or theories of conflict or interest-based negotiation. Another one of the sets of lenses is our model of practice, whether it's evaluative, directive, narrative, etc. That influences how not just what we do, but how we see what's presented in front of us. And the last is the contextual factors. I work primarily in private practice, but if I were working at the mediation clinic at Strathclyde, I would be responsible for, first of all, the certain types of disputes that would come, but there are rules, regulations, policies, procedures, forms, and all of those things affect how I see my work, how I experience the parties, and how I make decisions. So all of these things are operating. So if we're not aware of them, then what happens is that they operate anyway, but by becoming aware of what our beliefs are, it gives us the ability to do what I'm going to talk about in a minute, which is actually apply those theories in a conscientious and predictable and effective sort of way. And that is this, learning how to connect theory to practice, how we how we take our thinking and use it to make practice decisions. I'll give you a quick example. In a construction dispute I worked on, involved three parties: an architect, a developer, and a general contractor. And there was some problem that occurred during construction, and there was a question about whose fault it was, who was going to pay for whatever extra cost might be incurred. And the parties eventually came to see me, and I started to think, what could possibly be the explanation for the fact that three people who were partners, who knew one another well, who were actually friends as well, couldn't reach an agreement about this? What could explain that? And one thought I had was that maybe, as often happens, this is the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. And that is that there had been a number of prior minor disagreements that had never been resolved, and that just lay there. And when this dispute came about, all of that came to the fore. All of that became so really important. Well, that was one idea I had. And if I had chosen that, I would obviously have wanted to be spending some time talking about the past. So it would have affected my practice choice. Another, I said, maybe it's a data problem. But this is just, and that maybe reference to, so that if that's the case, that they have a misunderstanding of some crucial pieces of information, maybe the way to go is to ask them to bring in the contract documents, the blueprints and the specifications and so on. And that's how I would have proceeded had that been a possible explanation. I also thought, is it communication? You know, I know that that often people in conflict lose their ability, or their ability to communicate effectively is slightly diminished, sometimes significantly diminished. And then another consideration I had is, are there external forces that might be contributing to their difficulty? The point is that how I see their dispute, how I interpret the behavior and the information that I'm given, is going to very much determine the choices I make as a practitioner. What I focus on, the kinds of questions I ask, the sort of information that I hope they will bring forward. And if we're not clear about our theories, then it's very difficult to apply that theory to practice. We just go by rote. We go by what feels right. And sometimes what feels right works extremely well. And often it is not good. It is less effective, or possibly even ineffective. Just like the point I made earlier about about children always asking the question why. This is another key principle or pillar of reflective practice. We don't just look at situations, and by the way, Charlie made a comment earlier about the inventories that I created that were part of the book that he referred to, The Making of a Mediator. And I've changed the word problem. I don't think about it as a problem anymore, because that sounds like I talk about it as a practice dilemma. Because what I want to do is encompass the whole range of possibilities, that from success to, you know, abject disappointment. It could just be a matter of some puzzlement, some uncertainty, or the uncertainty could be, how was it that parties who seemed to be so much at odds 3 minutes ago are suddenly laughing with one another and sharing proposals and working very co-op? How in the world did that happen? That's also a practice dilemma that I think about, a surprising moment that I would want to explore in terms of reflective practice. So when I think about our work, it isn't just looking at trial and error, because trial and error, you say, oh, I'm never going to do that again. That didn't work. I'm going to try something else. Oh, that didn't work. I'm going to try something else. I'm interested, and in terms of reflective practice, the question is why? What was it that was occurring, either in the mediator, in the parties, or both, that may have led to this puzzling situation, this surprising moment, this instant of awkwardness? You know, I was doing a divorce mediation, and you know, the couple were working together reasonably well. When it came to talking about the finances, they were having some difficulty not reaching agreement. That wasn't, it was preliminary to that. The husband, who had brought spreadsheets, was explaining. And through my questions, I was trying to help him explain information to his wife. And she was, the more we did that, he and I working in concert to try to not just, I was trying to help him be more specific and clear in what he was saying in order to be helpful. But the more we did that, the more disaffected she was. She was looking bored. I actually had an image in my mind. I never had this happen before or since, of her standing up from her chair, putting on her coat, calmly walking to the door of my office, exiting, going out into the corridor, getting in the elevator, going down in the elevator, and walking out into the street and walking away. It just had a feeling that she was that disconnected with what was happening. And that awareness, I was wondering why that was happening. And it occurred to me, and so I made an intervention, which was to say to him, but for her benefit, sometimes we men, when we try to be really helpful, can end up being confusing and unhelpful. And she burst into tears. And she said, that's exactly right. And I said, after she calmed down, I asked her, what would help you? She said, I need to ask the questions. I need to gather the information in my own way so that I can make sense of this. You know, she said, I pay all the bills. I balance the checkbook. I'm not unfamiliar with finances, but I need to understand what this means for me. And the only way to do that is to ask questions. Well, if I hadn't explored the why of that behavior, I would have just missed it. And I would have continued on trying to help them manage a discussion about finances that most likely would have ended in a disaster, a failure, for sure. So when we're in the reflective practice groups, the question I often, almost always ask at some stage in the debriefing process, the reflective conversation process is, when this was going on, say to the mediator, when this was going on, what were you thinking? Because what I want to get at is the why of the experience. I never say, why do you think that happened? Because that immediately puts somebody on the defensive. They have to justify themselves. They have to explain themselves. I don't want them to do that. I want them to be thinking about what occurred and come up with their own explanation in the way that the father said to the daughter, why do you think after you started placing the X's in the corner, you worked and then it didn't work? He asked her, why did she think that happened? And she came up with her own explanation, which was the computer figured her out, which was really lovely. This questioning assumptions is really a key piece of our work. In reflective practice, sometimes these are we sometimes get into a situation where we're not aware of the assumptions that we are making that are guiding the decisions, and we need to take a step back from that. For example, I was working with in a reflective practice group, and this is mindful of the conversation earlier about ethics. I'm going to so conceal the information that the person I was talking with, not just the clients, would not know what I'm discussing. The mediator made a suggestion that perhaps it would be a good idea to get an expert to help sort out some very complicated pieces of information. And one of the parties immediately took offense and accused the mediator of being biased, of being prejudiced, of wanting to tilt the mediation in a certain direction. The mediator's assumption had always been good information leads to good decisions. And when you aren't able to either gather or process the information yourself, then it's valuable to get outside assistance. Now, that's a useful assumption to make. What she forgot was, and how how the mediator ended up being a problem, is that she disregarded notions about self-determination. So she needed to rethink her assumption about the data in light of how do you work with parties to help them make the choice rather than respond to a choice that you're putting in front of them. That the reason that she was considered to be biased was because she hadn't involved them in her consideration. And as it turned out, because we talked subsequently, when the mediator went back and engaged with the parties in a way of saying, so you're struggling a little bit with understanding this, what's the best way to work this out? And one of the parties in the mediation said, look, we've got a good friend who can help us. What say we go to that person? And the other person said, no, that's a great idea. And that's how they chose to do it. So we need to be able to question our assumptions about the way we do it. Some of the assumptions that we come with are sometimes that people in conflict are self-absorbed, they're wounded, they're compromised. And think about it, if that's the assumption that we make about the people in front of us, then isn't that how we're going to treat them? And is that really helpful? If they don't evidence any indication that they are weak, that they are wounded, that they are unnecessarily self-absorbed, why would we want to treat them as if they are, simply because we have a theory that says that, any more than we have the notion, oh, gee, when the emotional temperature rises in the room, got to separate the parties because when people get too emotional, they can't think so very clearly. Really? Really, is that the assumption that you want to work with? Think about it and think about how that applies, because it deserves to be challenged and questioned. We want to be able to practice self-awareness. It's really important. We get so focused in our work on what's happening outside, on observing the behavior, about listening to the language, about tracking the content, that we don't pay enough attention to what's happening inside of us, to the process of thinking about, reacting to, and responding to what's taking place with the parties. And one of the notions that I picked up in a number of instances, and I've used it as part of my own practice for over 30 years, is the notion of humility. And that is that it helps me to be more effective if I don't think of myself as the only expert in the room. and instead think of myself as having knowledge and experience that can be helpful, but the parties are also experts. They know themselves, they know the conflict, they know the impact of the conflict. And that's a measure of self-awareness that I have that allows me to engage with the parties in a different way. And I think is a critical piece of reflective practice. And lastly, embracing failure as your mentor. It's not easy to do. I'm going to tell a very brief story that distinguishes trial and error from genuine learning. I was working with a couple. It's their very first meeting after I'd finished my discussion about roles, responsibilities, confidentiality, and so on. I said, so you're going to be talking, you're getting a divorce, and you probably want to talk about this issue, this issue, this issue. I said, you know, and this was very early in my practice. And I said, so you probably want to put the personal property aside. That tends to be one of the easiest things to discuss. And they started laughing at me as one of them reached into his briefcase and pulled out a 16-page, single-spaced, typed list of personal property. They were collectors. And they said, well, it might not be as easy as you think, Mr. Lang. Now, I could have taken that as a way of saying, I'm never going to say that again about the fact that it's easy to do. Instead, I asked myself, why did I say that in the first place? And I realized that I was trying to engage with them, trying to settle them, trying to have them feel as though there's hope, there's possibility, this can be done. And I realized I'm taking far too much responsibility for them when I do that. And so I don't anymore say, I ask them, what do you want to talk about? What's critical? Do you want to do it on this basis, how they set the agenda, not me, because I respect their ability to help shape the process. And because I learned from that experience that I don't need to persuade them of anything. I don't even need to persuade them that it's a good idea to be there. That's not my job. And when I take on a responsibility that's not mine, I can come across as foolish in some instances, overbearing in others. Lastly, I've written another book on reflective practice. Here it is. It's called The Guide to Reflective Practice and Conflict Resolution. And it is available from my public. This is the shameless self-promotion part. It's available from the publisher, Roman and Littlefield, and they are offering attendees of the conference, anybody who's registered, whether they're here or they watch on video, a 30% discount if you use that code. Lastly, I'm always eager to exchange ideas and information with people about reflective practice. It's really important to me. If you want to learn more about reflective practice, I've got a wealth of information I'd gladly share. If you want to understand more about reflective practice groups, how to form them, how they work, and so on, just contact me. I'd be delighted to be able to speak with you. Okay, let's see if there are any comments or questions.
Thank you very much, Michael. I'm just scanning. So we have one question. Let's start. We'll start with that. I suspect there may be more, and we don't have a great deal of time. Someone's asking what kind of reflective exercises a mediator might engage in to help them identify and separate their own beliefs that are present during the mediation, and particularly if they hinder effectiveness. So I guess that's getting in about your the last couple of things that you discussed.
Right. Well, there are there are a few ways to do that. Let me just say that in the reflective practice groups I facilitate, this is part of the process that goes on as we talk about what belief may have influenced the way in which a mediator saw a situation and therefore responded to it. So that's one really wonderful way. And as somebody mentioned in the earlier chat with the interview that Barbara, Dr. Wilson did with you, Charlie, reflective practice groups are really an ideal way for learning. It's not always possible to participate, or if you're a member of a group, but it's between meetings, pardon me, then one of the ways to do that is there are these inventories in my book, and they're updated and reproduced in the new book, the ones you mentioned, Charlie.
Yeah.
The other thing that you can do is just simply sit down and make a list of the things that you believe in, and take the little diagram that I included, the constellation of theories, and start there. It's a very useful process that can be done alone. Can be done as part of your learning journal as well, if you keep a learning journal. That's how I have recommended people go about it.
Thank you, Michael. I mean, if anyone else has a question, we've probably got time for one more, but I just wanted to come back at you. One thing that sparked my curiosity was this question of embracing failure. It seems to me that, the moments of disaster, they have a stickability in my head that have shaped my practice. And I just wondered if you've got any thoughts about how to, because they're also quite difficult to recover from. Anything about how we might do that without unnecessarily wounding ourselves or plunging ourselves into despair, because a lot of the literature doesn't talk very much about failure. A lot of the literature talks about success all the time.
Right, and they talk about the success rates, and yes. I don't believe that it's useful to give ourselves a boot in the rear when we've made a mistake. That's okay, and the bruise will heal, but you need to find a way to make sense of it and to learn from the experience. So the first thing is to recognize. I have a quote that I use, and that I picked up from one of my sons, from Samuel Beckett. Ever tried, ever failed, try again, fail better. So it's a recognition. We start with this sense of humility that I'm not perfect. I am not going to do everything perfectly. I will go back, for example, and watch the video of this, and I will find the moments when I thought that I came across clearly and I said what I'd hoped to. And those moments when I do, the flat forehead kind of thing, saying, oh my gosh, how could I have been so dense and inarticulate? And I will use that as a way of reworking. I'll do two things. I will rework the presentation if I want to give it again. And secondly, I'll try to figure out why I got into that situation in the first place. What happened? Was I being inattentive? Was I distracted by something? Was I trying too hard? Did I not think clearly enough in advance about what I wanted to? Yeah. What is it? And so those are some of the ways. But we have to start with that sense of humility and recognition that we're all going to be imperfect.
Thank you, Michael. I'm conscious one more question just came in, and it's such a good one. I'm going to offer you about a minute, as the interviewers on the TV do, which is from Tom, actually, our speaker at 11 o'clock. What are your views on reflective practice being used as a means of measuring quality of practice or appraising mediators, perhaps in place of a rules-based system? Thoughts on that?
Well, there are reasons why in programs you want to be able to evaluate mediators' performance and decide whether somebody is suitable for the program or whether they aren't. And I think reflective practice is the first place you start with supervision as a way of helping the person gain an awareness of their strengths and their limitations. If you tell somebody it's a piece of information, but the question is how they use that information, and through reflective practice, they not only gain the information, but they have an ability to synthesize it, to make sense of it and incorporate it. And that's what's really critical. And there also can be moments when the administrator of a program says, we've had this conversation over and over and over. Remember, we've tried to do this. We've tried, so on. I'm just going to have to ask you to not take any more cases. There is a moment when that sort of a judgment is appropriate. But I don't think you lead with the judgment. You don't start with the idea, is this person suitable or not suitable? You start with the idea of, how can I help this person be the best mediator they can be? And then if they can't be really effective, then you can switch. I think you have to, it's a different function, but one that shouldn't be considered apart from reflective practice.
Thank you. I'm really conscious that time is running away from us. We want to let people have their lunch. There's another question, an excellent question from Steve Nail, which I don't think we've got time. Maybe we'll come back to that in the panel discussion at 10 to 4. I just want to finish by thanking you, Michael. That was really fascinating. I've never met you before, but I really appreciate the kind of gentle, systematic delivery and the way you've just taken us through these principles. It's given me a huge amount to think about, and I'm sure everybody else. So we can't clap, but we can. I will clap and say thank you very much.